Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, greetings to whoever is watching this video. My name is Eleanor Phoenix and I create beauty content all incorporating political and social commentary. Before I get into the topic of today's video, I think I need to reiterate my stance within the political spectrum. I'm on the left, but I'm not a liberal. If you want a more in-depth video on my political views, then click the video over here. My skin currently feels like I spent 40 days and 40 nights in the Judean desert without food or water, so it's time for a little pampering session. If you want to do a little skincare with me while you're watching this video, then please join in. We can pretend we're having a girls' night in, or a manly sleepover, or a gender-neutral slumber party, or whatever. If you don't feel like joining in on the fun, then at least go get yourself a glass of water. I can see that your pores are practically begging for a drop of hydration in your system. I'll wait. And with that, let's get into the video. Liberal and left-leaning political parties tend to pride themselves on being open-minded and forward-thinking. People who lean towards the left are definitely more respectful and tolerant on average than conservatives tend to be. But is everyone on the left as open-minded and respectful as we like to think we are? Truthfully, I don't think so. There are plenty of close-minded, opinionated individuals that consider themselves to be liberal or left-leaning in their politics. It's easy to find them when you scroll through apps like TikTok to find hundreds of videos on people literally wishing death upon people who they disagree with. Now, I understand their point of view when someone holds an opinion that infringes on your rights. In reality, if it's an opinion, then it shouldn't be harmful. I understand the frustration of uterus owners seeking justice for the people who would force children and unconsenting adults into motherhood, carrying out a pregnancy and giving birth. I understand the anger towards white police officers using their power and their privilege to get away with murdering and harming the BIPOC community. Anger is a very human emotion and it's useful to a certain extent, but you cannot let anger control you and your actions, nor can you let anger guide your politics, because ultimately the person who will end up carrying that burden of rage isn't the people you are directing your anger towards. You will be the one who suffers most. I understand that emotions play a big role in helping us empathize with other people and fight for what we believe to be morally correct. But there is a certain division within the left that take almost everything as a reason to riot and cause havoc. Instead of focusing on being morally correct, a lot of the time I see the people are solely trying to be politically correct. There is a big difference between the two. Morals concern the principles of right and wrong behavior and focuses on ethics, whereas political correctness focuses on fitting into a political ideal. On paper, this might not seem particularly harmful, but it can be. When you are too focused on being politically correct, you can end up silencing important voices that might contradict what you would like to believe, and you can end up supporting the wrong people. For example, a lot of liberals don't want to talk about the sudden incline in detransitioners within recent years because it's not politically correct to do so, and they seem to believe that the existence of these people somehow takes away from the transgender community, which isn't true. The existence of a minority doesn't steal anything from the majority. It's important to amplify both transgender and detransitioners' voices because we can learn a lot from both of these groups of people. We can become more respectful, tolerant, and we can learn the differences between gender, gender identity, gender expression, and sex. All of these lessons help us grow into better, wiser individuals with more knowledge to make good decisions in our personal lives, professional lives, and within the scope of politics. There are people that would argue that detransitioners' voices are being amplified more than transgender voices, despite the fact that only a small percentage of transgender people ever regret their transition. Number 1. Unless you're exclusively consuming conservative media, that first part just isn't true. Liberal media often doesn't talk about detransitioners at all and sweeps the problem under the rug. Second, how do you know how many people regret their transition? Because currently nobody is keeping track of the exact number. People who came out as transgender but never underwent any surgical changes and then realized that they weren't trans are also detransitioners. Then there are people who did undergo surgical transitions but never officially told their therapists, doctors, or surgeons that they were detransitioning. Thus, the statistics that we have concerning detransitioners isn't at all accurate. Once again, detransitioners are being swept under the rug. They're being ignored because it's easier to ignore a problem than face it head on. And I repeat what I said before. The existence of a minority doesn't steal anything from the majority. Let's use a different perspective to help us understand. If bisexual women who married men were being ignored, shunned by the majority of liberal society and told they shouldn't be given platforms simply because of the fact that their existence somehow takes away from the validity of lesbians and bisexual women married to women, that form of ignorance and bigotry wouldn't be tolerated. Or maybe it would be, since biphobia is a recurring problem even within the LGBT community. But I rest my case. Another example of what happens when you focus on political correctness instead of morals is cancel culture. Cancel culture probably deserves its own video, so I won't go into too much detail right now, but I will in a future video, so subscribe if you want to be notified when that comes out. People can be ostracized and thrown out of social or professional circles, both online and in person, simply for saying something that other people disagree with. And of course, when this happens, it can be massively detrimental to the mental health of the person being ostracized. If the person already suffers from a mental illness, their exclusion can be deadly. And then there are people who are more concerned with you using inclusive language when talking about abortions than the issue of abortion itself. Don't use the word woman is injected into the conversation instead of focusing on the actual issue, which is that our bodily autonomy is being invaded. This is what happens when you're more concerned with being politically correct than being morally right. Of course, language is an important part of culture and is the principal method of communication, but human rights are a lot more consequential and have a much bigger impact. In the bigger scheme of things, it doesn't matter all that much whether I'm using the terms woman or female or AFAB, because we all know who the conversation is centered around when we're talking about abortions. We're talking about people with the ability to get pregnant and give birth. There's also the unfortunate fact that individuals often have to tiptoe around each other in order to not offend each other, which isn't helpful in dismantling racist, sexist, or bigoted systems. I found a clip of a Will Witt video on Twitter of a Native American man whose name I unfortunately couldn't find, who summed things up perfectly.
We live in a culture and a society where outrage has become a recreational pastime, where people nit and pick until they find something wrong, and then they become outraged by it. And that, for me, I believe that hurts cross-cultural relationships. I believe it hinders us helping to understand each other. And I always start off every tour and every questionnaire session with, I'm very difficult to offend. And I believe that the most offensive questions are the questions that need to be asked and answered.
There's an important lesson that everyone needs to learn at some point to become functioning members of society and make the right decisions both in politics and in everyday life. We need to learn how to think, not what to think. It might sound simple to learn, but it is incredibly easy to get wrapped into thinking the way that everybody around you thinks. It's much easier to fit in than go against the grain. For that reason, people who grew up in conservative areas are usually conservative, and people who grew up in liberal areas are usually liberal. Further division is created within the left on matters such as black hairstyles, which concerns the constant battle of cultural appropriation versus cultural appreciation. The line between what is considered offensive and what isn't can sometimes be very blurred. Is wearing box braids offensive if you aren't black? Is using AAVE offensive if you aren't an African American? A lot of the time it depends on who you speak to. But let's attempt to answer these questions. First of all, what does it mean to appreciate or appropriate culture? Cultural appreciation is appreciating another culture in an effort to broaden your perspective and connect with others cross-culturally, while cultural appropriation is taking one aspect of a culture that is not your own, such as culturally distinct items, aesthetics, or spiritual practices, and mimicking it without consent, permission, or any cultural context or relationship to that item or practice. The primary difference between cultural appreciation and appropriation is that of consent or permission to share in a cultural exchange. Second of all, I don't think it is our place to get offended for someone else, because sometimes when you get offended for another group of people, you can end up talking over that group of people, despite the fact that their voices and opinions matter more. A great instance of this is the backlash that Adele received over wearing Bantu knots during the Jamaican Carnival Festival. A lot of non-Jamaican people had plenty to say and called her out on it, saying it was offensive and racist. But when you scrolled through the Instagram comment section, nearly every single Jamaican came to her defense. This is a prime example where the intent was to celebrate someone else's culture without trying to hand it off as her own. By definition, that means she was appreciating Jamaican culture, not appropriating. To be honest, I don't understand the gatekeeping of hairstyles, and I probably never will, because I didn't grow up in a culture that places much value in hair. If someone kidnapped me today, shaved my head, and then let me go, I probably wouldn't bat an eye. I'd just be grateful that they didn't do anything to hurt me. Of course, on one hand, I do understand that there are cultures that value hair and see it as a spiritual practice or something sacred, and I respect that. But on the other hand, wasn't a goal of segregation to separate black and white people and prevent us from coexisting? Coexisting with a different race, especially a race with a different culture to your own, means cross-cultural relationships are formed, and parts of our cultures end up being shared. Some of the best things in modern day are only here because of cross-cultural relationships. For our first example, let's look at South African culture, my culture. Cape Malay is a fusion cuisine that originated in the Western Cape province. It's a blend of Malaysian, Indian, and Indonesian together with local South African cuisine. There's bobotie, koeksuster, Cape Malay curry, susati, and malva pudding. And for our second example, let's look at Carnaval in Brazil, which is influenced by both Portuguese colonizer and tribal African traditions. Although the practice of carnivals originated from Europe, African influence is evident in the Brazil carnivals that we see today. Due to the African slave trade, the carnivals adapted the tribal practices, which included parading around the village, which was actually done to ward off all the bad spirits in the area. People began to use costumes and tribal masks during the celebrations, and feathers were also used in many of the African costumes, as this symbolized rebirth and the rise of the spirits. There are so many more examples of creations that only exist because of cross-cultural relationships, but if I sat here to go through all of them, then this video would end up being way too long. I'm not trying to tell people that they have no right to defend their own culture, nor that they should accept disrespect. I'm not trying to invalidate anybody's experiences with racism or xenophobia, and I'm not saying that you can't or shouldn't get offended when someone is being blatantly rude. My point is that when we are constantly worried about overstepping and offending somebody, we can end up doing more harm than good. We can end up ruining the chances of cultures combining together to create something new and extraordinary. The goal of anti-racism isn't the segregation of cultures and races. The goal is to heal, to teach, and to discover, and infusing them all means that we can become a truly anti-racist, diverse, and multicultural society. My skin feels super refreshed and hydrated after all of that treatment. I look like a brand new woman. And you look okay too, I suppose. Definitely better than you did at the start of this video, but that might be to do with the fact that you got to spend time with me instead of worry about all of your silly little life problems. You're welcome. That's all I have to say in this video today. I want to thank you all very much for watching. If you want to see more of me, then please subscribe to the channel. You can also follow me on Instagram or on TikTok. It's at Eleanor I Phoenix on all platforms. I also have a Twitter account that I never use, but you're more than welcome to follow me on there too. I hope to see you all in my next video. Peace, love, and respect.